Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to paint this bright, beautiful parrot. I am in a tropical mood, and I am Viv. Welcome to Art with Viv. I am so glad you're here. Now, this parrot looks complicated. It's a lot simpler than it looks, and I promise you, if you take your time, we're just going to be using basic watercolor techniques. You will be able to paint this gorgeous parrot. Now, the first thing I did, I'm cheap. So I'm using the excess that was left over from last week's puffin. If you didn't see that, I will link it. I will link that puffin so that you can go watch that video, but it's the video I did last Monday. But I want to protect that painting, so all I'm doing is taking a piece of tracing paper and I'm just taping it over my little puffin. I do not want him to get splashes or drips of paint on him. And I'm just going to go ahead and tape off the edges of my parrot. I like that white border that leaves. I think it gives it a nice little finished look. After you finish painting and you pull the tape up, you have that gorgeous white border, and it really sets off the paint, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I did draw this a little bit darker than normal. I don't want those pencil lines to show through my paint. So I just took a kneaded eraser and I rolled it into a hot dog shape, and I'm just rolling it over that graphite drawing, and that just picks up the excess graphite so it doesn't turn my watercolor gray and you don't see it through the layers of watercolor as much. So now we're just going to do a little wet on wet technique. Easy peasy. It is a common technique for watercolor artists, and it is, one of the foundational techniques. So I just wet this area with a little bit of clean water, and I'm taking my brush and I am just dropping in that bright green. I mixed up a nice sort of bright yellow green, and that's just going to go across the cap of his head. He has some really gorgeous green feathers and blue. He's just a gorgeous bird, let's face it. And now I'm going to mix up sort of a bluish green to go in those areas. That looks a little duller. I don't know about that color, so I think I'm going to add a little teal to that, a little bit of teal into that mixture just to brighten it up, and that's much better. That's more like what I see on my reference photo. So I'm going to go ahead and just drop that in while it's still wet, and I'm letting the water do the work. Let that water mix the green and the blue together. Now I'm going to make a little bit of a darker green, and the shadows right here where the top of his little forehead attaches to his nostrils, and right over his eye he has a little shadowy area. So I just drop that in and let the water sort of pull it up into the forehead area. Now I'm taking a little bit of that blue and a little bit of that green. He has really pretty blue-green eyes. They really lean more toward blue, and so I'm taking that and I'm really watering it down because I want it to be a pale color. And I'm just doing the iris with that really pale blue color. I'm going to let that dry a little bit. I've mixed a little bit of purple here. He has a little bit of purple around his eyes. It's just the faintest little tidbit, and I'm going ahead and doing a wash of that. And that is wet on dry. The paper is dry. I did not wet it first. I'm just painting directly onto the paper. And I'm also going to come up here. I have mixed a little bit of pinkish orange for his nostril area, his little nose here. And I'm going ahead and painting that in there, and just into where some of the darker areas are. It's sort of a flesh color, but it still leans a little bit orange. And I may adjust that as we go on. Let me get a little bit closer so you can see what you're doing. I also, if you notice, put a piece of paper towel over my puffin painting, so that can also act as an extra barrier. I really don't want to mess up my puffin painting, but I don't want to peel this piece of paper off of my block just yet. I want it to stay secure to the block so I don't have to stretch it. And yes, I'm lazy and I'm cheap, but hey, it works for me. Now you can do it how you want to do it, but I'm gonna do it the lazy, cheap, easy way. Now I'm just taking a really much darker green. I've changed to a much smaller brush, and I'm going ahead and putting in even a darker shadow in some of these areas, and that just gives it a little bit more definition. I really like that. You want to have contrast in in your colors and painting, gives it more interest. So now I've mixed up a black. You can use a two black. Two blacks tend to look a little flat, so I usually like to mix my own blacks, but it's totally up to you. I want you to paint whatever is the easiest for you, however you want to do it. Just know that two blacks do look a little flat when they're dry, so I like to mix my own blacks using like complementary colors, a blue and an orange, a blue and a brown, a red and a green. Sometimes you can add the third color, mix the three primary colors together and get a good black. It's really just experiment and see what works for you. So I've also put his eyeliner on with that black, and now I'm just adding a little bit of shadow in that purple area. And by the way, follow me at Art with Viv. You will find me everywhere on the internet at Art with Viv. So let's connect around the web if you are so inclined. So now I have gotten a little bit darker of that sort of blue-green, really pale blue-green mixture. And he has sort of a dark shadowy color ring around the center of his iris. So I went ahead and put that in. And now I'm just taking a really watered down mixture of that black that I did, so it's really a gray color once you water it down, and I'm adding some shadows around his eyes. I'm looking at my reference photo. Now if you want to get the reference photo, an outline drawing to trace, the supply list of the exact colors I use, along with where I use the colors, the little mixing guide, then please consider joining my sweet art squad. You will find it at Art with Viv. And it's only $5 a month. It's like cheaper than a fancy coffee, and you'll get 4 videos and 4 supply lists a month. So it's a good investment if you're inclined. I'll link it below in the description. But let's move on. So I took a wash of that pinky orange and I put it over his nostrils. I did a little bit more shadows around his eyes, and now I'm taking that black mixture, and he has like little feathers on the white part of his face, and so they're just like in little chunks. They're like little chunky feathers, so I'm painting those in, and that's just going directly onto the dry paper. I put a little shadow where his nostril, that little pink fleshy nostril, meets his face, has a little bit of a pale gray shadow, and then just continuing on with these little feathers that are growing, in little sort of a little pattern across his face. So I'm going to let you watch that just for a second, and I will return. So once you get those little feathers in, you're going to want to come ahead and just start painting the feathers that are kind of connecting to his face and going right under his chin. I probably should have used a larger brush for this little area, but hey, I am just winging it as I normally do. Sometimes you just wing it. And I'm just trying to sort of block out the areas according to the reference photo. But of course, I can take some artistic license. I'm not trying to make an exact copy. I'm just trying to get the general shapes in the general area and the general lightness and darkness of these areas. So you see I got smart and I switched brushes, told you. Sometimes I get smart. Not always. But I got smart. I changed to a larger brush so that this would go a little bit faster. And I'm just doing sort of shaggy little brush strokes right on the edges to indicate sort of a feathery look. And just sort of like right around the edges, it just adds a little extra texture to it. I'm not being overly, crazy or just trying to get every little detail in. So now I've mixed up another batch of black, and I am painting this bottom part of his bill. It looks a little blue to me. I'll probably add a little bit of orange or a little bit of brown to sort of knock that blue back just a touch in my next round. I could leave it blue like that. It doesn't overly bother me, but it bothers me a little bit. So while that is wet, I'm going ahead and dropping in a little bit more of that darker mixture into that ruffled area under his chin. And then you see some of his feathers on his face have dried lighter. Keep that in mind when you work with watercolor. It always dries a little bit lighter than it looks when it's wet. So I'm just darkening up those feathers just a little bit, since they dried a little lighter than I wanted. On the reference photos, those are some really black looking feathers. They're really beautiful looking have a high contrast on the reference photos. So I want to keep those as dark as possible. Now I'm coming down here to his bottom bill again, the bottom half of his beak. And he has some color changes. On the side of his beak, it's really dark and black. Like on the edge of his beak, right under the top part of his beak, it's a little bit paler. So I'm trying to get those in. Now I'm going to let that dry a little bit. You see, I also left a white gap between those two spaces on his bottom beak because that's a lighter color in that gap. And we're going to paint that once those other two dry. For right now, we are just wetting this top half of his beak, the top portion of his beak. Notice I'm leaving some white areas of the paper dry because that's going to be my highlights. You got to leave those dry. And then I'm just dropping in my dark mixture. I'm not doing it as heavily as I did it in that bottom beak. I'm letting some of the white of the paper shine through. I'm just sort of dropping it in a little bit. I'm not making it a solid color. I want it to have that more watery, spontaneous effect on this top upper beak because there's a lot more white on this upper beak. There's a lot more light on there, and it has a bigger variation of the grays and the blacks on it. So that's what I'm trying to go ahead and do and not make it really solid right off like I did on the side of his bottom beak. So now I'm adding more pigment, more paint to some of the areas that I see that are darker, that has some shadows. And I'm doing this while it's still wet so that the edges will be soft. There won't be hard, sharp edges. I want it to sort of blend in really softly. I'm also using a lifting technique, and that's all you do is you wipe your brush off, get the excess moisture out, and then run it through, just run it over the area where you want to pick up the excess pigment, the excess paint, and then wipe that excess out on your paper towel, sponge, whatever you're using. So now you see I went ahead and put a really pale gray where that little white stripe was on the bottom part of his bill. So that kind of makes the bill a solid now. It's just different shades of this blackish gray color we got going, this charcoaly color. So now I'm going back to my blues and my greens I mixed up for the top of his head, and he has some of those blue and green feathers sort of sticking out from under this little black ruffle of feathers under his chin. So I'm just going ahead and painting those in, and I'm just doing wet on dry. I'm going straight directly onto dry paper when I do this. I want the color to be more solid, and I want it to be in, I want it to stay where I put it. If the paper was wet first, the paint would travel all over the place. The water would be the boss of it, and the water would really dictate where it went. And I want this paint to stay in the places that I put it. So now I've gone back over. I've added a little bit more pink to that orangey mixture to make it a little more flesh colored, it's not really flesh colored, but it's a little pinker than it is orange. And now I'm just going where I see some shadows on those nostrils, those little fleshy nostrils he has at the top of his beak. And I'm doing sort of a scumbling. I'm calling it scumbling. I'm just sort of doing really raggedy tiny brush strokes to give it some texture, and just all over, just sort of vibrating the tip of my brush to get those little dots of pink color in. And now I'm coming down here off of the side of his mouth into the skin of his face. He has lots and lots of creases and wrinkles. He has dinosaur skin. You know, birds and reptiles are related. And so where he doesn't have feathers, he has some really crinkly skin like a reptile might. So I'm just doing really faint lines. And they're just, you know, sort of crinkly and jiggity-jaggedy. They're not straight lines. I just want to give that impression that he's got wrinkly jaws there. So that's all I'm doing. I also added a little bit of pink to some of the areas on the reference photo. Some of those folds and creases have a little pink tinge to them. And now I'm just going ahead around his eye in those feathers, making a little bit of a really pale gray shadow in there. Now I have jumped back over to his beak. It's a little more dry, and I just added a few little shadows in there. Now I'm jumping over to his cheek again, and really I'm trying to work around his whole face so that one area doesn't get overworked, and then I keep sort of a unification and a balance by working around his whole face at one time. Now I'm going really, really dark. This is the shadow between his upper and his lower beak. His beak is just slightly open. You see I'm leaving a tiny white line at the bottom of his beak and at the top of his beak, and that sort of differentiates it. It's also in the reference photo that there is a pale line there, so I'm leaving that. I'm coming up here and I am just adding a little bit more pink to some of the shadow areas of his nostrils, and I'm trying to leave the highlights, you know, without a lot of pink in them, so that there will be a shadow and light areas. And going back to his beak, I'm adding a little bit more shadows. He's got a nice little shadow right there on the top part of his beak, so I'm just going ahead, putting that in. And it's almost dry now, so there are hard lines, and I actually want these hard lines because he has a lot of streaks in his beak. It looks like his beak's been banged up a little bit from the reference photo, been scraped and scratched a little bit. So he has some different variations of this black color. It goes from black to really a pale gray to a medium gray and even a white, almost white gray. So that's where I want to get all those different variations of color. Gives us some interest, gives us some texture, but he looks like he's been through some things on this beak, and that's okay. It makes him interesting. Maybe he's a gangster bird. We don't know. Could be a gangster. Who was that? Like Iago. Maybe he's like Iago. He's all a villain. We don't know. We could be just painting an old villain parrot. Who knows? Anyway, yeah, I do like to make up little stories of my subjects as I paint them, and we have gotten him into being some kind of desperado or something just because his beak's messed up. We don't know what happened. So I'm just added some more darker layers to that bottom beak. I'm taking that gray, that black mixture and really putting a lot of water, so it's really a really pale gray. And I'm just working in some shadows right onto dry paper. Right where his forehead meets his face, there's some shadows. In between those feathers under his eyes, there's some shadows. We're just doing it with that really, really watered down black that, you know, turns into a gray when you water it down. Because with watercolors, you use the white of the paper. You don't use white paint. You use the white of your paper, or you use water to lighten a color. So you don't normally, in traditional transparent watercolor, use white. So now I've just darkened up some of those wrinkles and crinkles in his cheek there with that pale gray. Now we are going to work on these. We are going to work on these feathers right coming off of his face. They are a nice brilliant orange. So I've got a nice orange. I've got a nice yellow on my palette. I'm going straight onto dry paper. I am just dropping the yellow right into the orange. Once I put the orange up, I'm just dropping the yellow directly into it. I'm not mixing them on the palette. I'm letting the paper mix them. Oh, it's so bright and pretty. I really like this. Coming back in with a little bit more of the orange where I want it to be darker. Again, using those feathery little strokes at the tips to make it look like feathers and give it some texture. Now I'm just picking up a little bit of that excess paint And I have dried my brush on the paper towel, and I'm just sort of dabbing up some of the excess in some areas where I want it to be a little bit lighter when it dries. And I've got that yellow. I'm looking at my reference photo. I'm trying to get the yellows and the oranges in the correct spot. Again, I'm not trying to make a copy, but I'm just trying to get it generally correct so that it's convincing. We just want it to be a convincing Iago, Parrot, bad guy. We don't know. We don't know about this parrot's past. Maybe he was on a pirate ship. Maybe he was, I don't know who, Blackbeard's parrot. I don't know. You know they live a long time. He could have been, well, maybe not that long, but they live a long time. Parrots, just by their very nature, are gangster. So as you see right here on his chest, I'm just putting down orange and yellow alternately, letting the edges mix together. I'm not being too fussy about it. I'm not, getting my panties all up in a wad. I'm just going with the flow of how it's looking and just trying to get the yellows and the oranges in the correct vicinity of where they are on the reference photo. And of course I have to speed this up because nobody wants to watch a 5-hour video. So I have sped this up to 200%. And it's a little bit longer than my normal videos, but I really enjoyed doing this one. Again, I just touched up a few of the shadows on his face with that really watery gray. Now I'm coming back in with some of that orange. And I've gotten it more concentrated, which means it just has a little bit less water. And I'm going into where the shadows of the feathers are. And again, I'm doing those just stroke marks, those just long brush strokes to indicate the texture of feathers. I'm not trying to paint every individual feather. I'm not that ambitious. Not only am I cheap and late, but I'm lazy as well. So we're not going to paint every feather. We're just going to do some indications. So now that has dried a little bit. The under painting has dried a little bit. I've switched over to a smaller brush. And I'm just starting to paint in some really fine lines to indicate, the feathery texture. Again, I am not painting every single feather. I am just, giving that indication of feathers. And we're letting your eye do the work. I'm telling you, your brain is magnificent. If you just give it a little bit of information, it will run with that information and it will put together that is a feather without you having to paint a feather. Your brain is amazing. It will fill in the blanks. You just give it a little bit of information and it will run with it. Of course, I have mixed up a little bit more blue-green. These feathers right here are already dry. I mean, this blue-green section is completely dry. So I'm doing really tiny little hash marks, little tiny brush strokes, really fine, just to indicate that is also a nice fluffy feather under there. Ooh, we could name him Fluffy. Fluffy the parrot. Anyway, I'm continuing to do that in just some strategic spots, adding those brush strokes to indicate feathers. Like I said, I'm lazy, not about to paint every feather on here. Just ain't gonna happen. And you don't really need to. And remember, you're not supposed to look at a watercolor up close. You need to stand back from it. That's how you're supposed to view watercolor. And all those elements will come in. So now I've just added a few more shadows to the green and blue cap area, his forehead. I mixed up a little bit more of that teal with the green, and I'm just doing some shadows to indicate where there are clumps of feathers on the top of his little head. Right here in this really pale area, he has some shadows in there, so I'm just taking the tip of my brush and putting in another layer of that black that we mixed to get that shadow in there. And now I'm just taking a damp brush with just a tiny bit of that really watery gray and going over some of those gray areas just to blend them in, soften them. They're a little too pale, and we just want to knock those back a little bit, but without making them blend in. We want it, to be a little less noticeable, but we still want you to be able to see that there is a border there. I'm just darkening up some of those little creases again, putting some shadows, putting a little shadow where his eyelid, across the top of his eye. His eyelid is shadowing that part of his eye, so we just put a little darker bit of that blue-green. Now I'm wetting his shoulder. My brush is not clean, so there's a little orange that got on it. I'm not going to worry about it. The blue will overtake it. It will not be as bright of a blue as it would be if that was totally white, clean water. But we are not going to stress. It will be fine. As you see, you really don't even notice. And we wet it with the water, then we just drop the blue in, and now I'm just in certain areas dropping a little bit more blue in. I didn't like that blue going over my orange, so I dabbed it up with a little bit of paper towel. I'm taking some of this darker blue, and I am adding some shadows up here on his forehead while his wing dries just a touch. I went ahead and got some more yellow green. I wanted that to be a bit brighter, so I'm just doing a little wash over that. And he is starting to really look good. I'm putting a little bit more of some transparent yellow just right over that green. That brightens it up quite a bit. One of my hairs was down here in the blue. My hair falls out all the time. Sorry about that. And now I'm just lifting some of the excess blue where I want to have some highlights. All I'm doing is I'm dabbing my paintbrush off onto my paper towel, removing the excess moisture, and then pulling up or lifting some of the paint from that area. And then I wipe off that excess paint right onto the paper towel and just repeat that until the area is as light as I want it to be. So that's all I'm doing there. That's all lifting is. You just use a damp, dry brush, lift up the excess pigment, wipe it off, and go back and get more pigment as needed. And that's just the technique of lifting. So now I'm adding more shadows right across the top of his eye, right underneath his eye. He has a little bit, it's darker than I have it on the reference photo, so you know we gotta get that in there. And again, I am darkening up his creases in his little wrinkly reptile face. Coming down here again, doing those little feathery brush strokes to indicate patches of feathers. His feathers are overlapping, sort of in a scale pattern like a mermaid tail. And we're just kind of indicating that. We're not going to draw each little section or paint each little section. We're just going to paint an indication and let our brain do the work. Where the blue and the orange feathers sort of overlap each other, there's a lot darker of an area there. So I'm just coming right in there and painting that blue right into the orange, and it makes it look darker. Even though I'm using that same exact blue that I'm using right now, I used that on that orange, but because orange and blue are complementary colors, they made that sort of grayish, blackish color, make it look like a shadow color. So that's a little trick for you there. That's a little tip. If you want something to look dark, mix two complementary colors to get the shadow color. So I've gotten all that. I'm doing that, putting all these little shadows in and these feathery little marks. Trying to also put some marks up into the shadows of the orange part. And I want to darken up this black, so I'm going back into my black. These black feathers, I painted over them with the green, and it sort of lightened them up. So I want them to actually be more pronounced, more black. So I'm just going over with another layer of this mixture of black, right on the edges, and pulling it over the green so that it has a nice texture and so that it looks like it's on top of the green. Because that green was just a touch bit opaque. It's not really opaque, but a touch bit opaque, and it was lightening up that black, and I didn't like that. So now I'm taking a darker blue and I'm adding it to some of the shadows here. Again, just doing tiny little strokes, little hairlines. Now I switched brushes to my bigger brush. I dipped it in water, clean water, and I'm just going over this whole area to soften everything, blend everything so that it's not just sitting on top of the paper. And I'm just coming into my black and I'm adding a little bit into that shoulder area where it is really dark. My camera turned off. Sorry about that. I don't know why, but I mixed a nice deep purple for the background. I thought it would be really pretty This is just a little too purple for me though. Just a little bit, just a tiny bit too purple for me. So I'm probably going to fix that. I'm going to go ahead with this first layer before I fix it. You have to work fast. You don't want it to dry. You want to keep it wet as you're painting, or you'll get hard edges, or you could get some blooms, some cauliflowers, some whatever you want to call them. You can get those, some runbacks, back runs, whatever. People call them different things. So you want to keep it wet, so you want to work fast. So I didn't want to change up in the middle, so I'm just going to go ahead and paint this purple and then go in with a darker color because this is too bright. I feel like it's fighting with my bird. I want my bird to be the center of attention. So I'm adding a little bit of a darker blue to that purple mixture, but I still want it to have some, I want it to be like a blue purple. I still want it to lean purple but not be as bright. So I'm still got the purple vibe going, but I've just added a bit of darker blue. That's much better. That's exactly what I wanted. It pushes that bright purple back into the background, and it doesn't fight with our bright bird as much. So I think that's pretty good. I like that. We'll probably leave that like that. That's pretty good. And when it dries, it will dry just a little bit lighter than what it looks right now, but I'm really pleased with it. I think it looks good. So now I have gotten my white gouache out. I'm just adding a few highlights here and there. On the beak, where his beak is scratched up, I'm just doing a little bit of scumbling, which is just, lightly tapping the brush as I go. Not doing a full stroke. I'm just tapping it and adding some of the white highlight areas with that white gouache. This is optional. You don't really have to add this. I'm just really being extra here. It has plenty of the highlights. You can see them. I'm just being extra. You don't even have to do this part if you don't want to. And I'm adding a little bit of white. His eye ring has some little bumps in it, so I just add some of the white gouache to sort of indicate those bumps. So now, let's see, our puffin was protected. It came out clean. We did not drip on our puffin, so that is good. We are going to just remove this tape, and there you go. You have a beautiful, bright parrot. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing. Share it with a friend if you know someone that will get something out of this. And thank you for watching and supporting me in my channel. I will see you soon, guys.